Hello and welcome to session 1 of the 2017 FBR Ops Series. Today's session is making franchise field reps more effective. Our panel today consists of 3 franchising experts, including Doug Bostic of Fazoli's Restaurants, Scott Hoots of American Family Care, and Greg Nathan, the founder of Franchise Relationships Institute. Welcome, gentlemen, and I want to hand things off now to FBR's president, Michelle Rowan, to kick off our conversation.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Doug, Scott, and Greg, for joining us today. I am very excited, especially for everyone that's listening, because there's a lot of expertise that we get to access today with these 3 gentlemen. And I've had the pleasure of working with both Doug and Scott and their systems for a while, and I've known Greg for years, and you won't find anyone that hasn't at least taken one tip from him that's met him. So I'm going to allow you guys to just give a brief bio. I know that we're providing bios for people, but just to give people some context of what size your system is, how long you've been with the brand or with franchising. So Doug, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Fazoli's Restaurants currently has just under 225 locations, of which 91 of those are soon to be 92, because we're opening up a new location a week from today. 92 franchise locations. We are currently have 37 restaurants under contract, and the brand is growing at a very fast pace. I've been with the brand for 17 years and was a fellow franchisee of 3 different concepts prior to coming to Fazoli's. So I like to think that I bring the opportunity to share my background with our current franchisees. My responsibility is not only in franchise sales, but also franchise operations, and that's a bit unique in the food industry to wear both those hats. But we're a fairly small but growing company, and again, a number of our people throughout the system wear various hats. But it's an exciting time for our brand. It's an exciting time to see it grow, and I'm happy to share any of our successes today during the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Scott, if you want to give some background about American Family Care and yourself.
Sure thing. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Scott Hoots here. Glad to be with you. I am the Vice President of Franchising with American Family Care. We are the #1 urgent care franchise system in the world, with 114 clinics open across the United States. I've been with American Family Care since July of 2013 in the same role. We've been franchising since 2009. We are the 3rd owner of this franchise system. It started originally as Doctors Express back in 2009. The ownership of the franchise system changed hands a couple of times. The system was actually started by some veterans of the franchising industry that many of y'all probably know, Tony Bonacuse and Peter Ross with the Senior Helpers group there. Changed hands a couple of times, landed with American Family Care in April of 2013. I joined shortly thereafter. I'm a 25-year veteran of the franchising business with particular expertise and experience in operations, spending a good part of my career with Domino's Pizza and other brands such as 1-800-Flowers and Ripley Entertainment, the franchisor of Ripley's Believe It or Not around the world. That's where I got a little bit of my weird sense of humor. So that's a little bit about me, Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And Greg, if you want to give a little bit about Franchise Relationships Institute and just the work that you've done with clients over the years.
Sure. I'll do a segue with the Believe It or Not. So I was a franchisee. I was a multi-unit franchisee with a brand called Brumbies, and I became the franchisor as the Vice President of Operations and also Marketing. And for the last 29 years, I've been an advisor to the franchising sector. I do a lot of research and a lot of teaching and education and writing. And I'm also a psychologist, which comes in handy at times. Thank
Fantastic. So again, I'm going to encourage everyone to use the chat box on the as we go through these topics, because we do have a lot of experience here and a willingness to share. So we want to make sure you get a lot of actionable ideas out of this. I'm just going to run through a couple things from our data before we start with the first question. What we have here is the questions that we ask on our survey, on our standard survey questions that surround training and support. What we have is the black is our benchmark of all systems that have done our survey in the last 12 months versus the top 50 of those. So the top of the best of the best, I guess, are in the red. So what you're seeing here is not surprising that overall they're outscoring the average. But if you look at it, the training and support questions on the left and in the middle are significantly, there's a bigger gap than the overall benchmark score from the whole survey. So training and support is one of the areas that we see companies scored the lowest. I think it's one, probably very hard to please everybody, but two, I think it's always, there's an evolution to the way that you support your franchisees, and getting that feedback on if you're delivering an experience that works for them is really important, as we can see from the top brands here. So the next slide, we have the field, asking questions specifically about the field support, the knowledge, the responsiveness, the support that the franchisee feels from that role. We don't ask that on our standard question, but it is a commonly asked custom question. So what we did was we threw up some questions here just to get a sense of if you're asking questions of your franchisees, things that you might want to consider including or asking, and that would be able to help you gauge where you're at now and what you might want to focus on in the years to come. So that's, we're just sharing those here with you. And then just the last data slide, I'll pause here so you can read. These are open-ended questions to get more in-depth feedback from the franchisees. And again, you can reference these after. And then the last data slide is just going to show on the left side the companies that did ask the custom questions surrounding the effectiveness or the business expertise of their field reps is along the left side, the vertical line. And the horizontal line, the bottom, is our standard questions that we ask surrounding training and support. So you can see it's a relation between both of those questions and how they're rated. So the companies that have high scores for the field reps are scoring higher in training and support, and lower on both are sitting there as well. So we just wanted to share that to help put some context around it. So now we're going to go in to a discussion, and I think what I want to do is start with you, Greg. You've done a lot of work with franchisors and support staff to really make sure that those visits and those relationships are productive and positive. And I wanted to just start with you about how can field managers and reps increase their credibility and the value that they add to the franchisee in their business. And we're going to start with your slide. So if we want to pull up your slide so you can talk to that.
Okay. This particular slide is based on some research where we asked franchisees how likely they would be to recommend their field consultant to other franchisees in the system. So it's like a net promoter score question. And we were particularly interested in the opinions of franchisees who were a promoter of their field manager. And if people said, you know, I really get a lot of value from my field consultant or field manager and I definitely recommend them, we asked them why. So we had thousands of comments and we did a theme analysis, and what you see here, the 5 main headings there are the themes that emerged. And I'll just talk to each of those for a moment. So the first theme, I've put it together, I've called it business-minded, but what we found out was the successful field managers, they really focus on business improvement. They focus on helping franchisees to grow their sales, their profitability, and to make sense of the numbers. And they were also sharing what other franchisees were also doing that was helping them to drive a successful business. Interestingly, just within that section, the most frequent area was delivering support with local area marketing, just in terms of what other franchisees are doing. So that's that green bit at the top. Percentages down the left are the frequency at which those themes emerge, and you can see that they're all pretty much the same. Michelle, is it okay if I just move through the other 4 sections?
So are you talking about the where they're at in their business?
Yeah, just those 4 sections on the slide there.
Oh, on the first slide. Yeah. No, please do go through them.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure if you meant the other slide. Yeah, and I would like to see if this ties also to, are these the things that are also going to lend to that credibility piece of that role as well?
Yes. And when I get to the last one, it's the most important, interesting in terms of credibility. But being able to engage in a positive way, when you turn up, you need to be, we were chatting earlier with Scott and Doug about pessimists and optimists. And I think it's very important. The field consultant puts forward this optimistic frame of mind, optimistic approach, because the franchisees often get stressed. They get down in the dumps. They get a bit gloomy. So being positive and motivating, not over the top, but just consistently encouraging is very important. As you can see, there's some themes there. The dependability section is just following through on what you say you're going to do, returning, calls promptly. I think it's good if they have an agreement with the franchisees about what's a reasonable time frame to return calls. And I often suggest maybe even a code that if something's red or urgent, let the field consultant know this is in your discussions with your franchisees, and you might say, look, I'll get back to you within an hour if it's urgent, otherwise give me 24 hours. The 4th one in the red there is just being honest, straightforward, cutting to the chase, just giving the facts. If the answer to a question is no, just saying, look, we can't do that, and then explaining why. Franchisees are often busy, they need to get on with their businesses, and many people reported that acting as an intermediary with head office. So if they're a bit stuck, it could be with someone in the marketing department or someone in finance, the field consultant could maybe take the franchisee's case with the franchisee back to head office or support office. That is often very useful. And the final one, Michelle, about being considerate. If you genuinely want someone else to succeed, and sometimes you need to state that I'm here to genuinely help you, that builds credibility immediately. It almost gives you permission to say things and go to places that you normally wouldn't do, because people understand you're coming from the right place. So they're the 5 things that would build credibility in the minds of franchisees.
Awesome. Perfect. You mentioned an agreed upon timeline, and I'm curious, Scott, and then I'll go to Doug. Do you guys have something in place like that? Is that left up to the field rep to establish with the people they're supporting, or do you give them a specific expectation of urgent versus non-urgent business and returning those calls? So if you want to start, Scott, then I'll go to you, Doug.
Yeah, sure. I'm a big believer in letting the 2 people in a relationship work that out, as opposed to me from home office dictating that. Now, obviously, there's some guidelines, Michelle, into that. If somebody thinks their definition of urgent is call you next week, that's unacceptable. But I think it's important to let the franchise business consultant or the field rep and the franchisee work out that cadence and set the expectations, and it's important for each one of them to deliver on it. In general, I'm thinking a 24-hour turnaround on a callback is probably acceptable. Urgent might be a little bit short of that.
Excellent. And Doug, how about you guys?
We by far, within 24 hours, we are back with our franchisees. I think that establishes credibility with anything that's going on, be it small or large item. That helps in our mind. Everything that we do is built around the foundation of building the relationship, and that's just one of the pieces. We actually stated it in our operations mission. Our very first sentence in that is to provide accurate and timely information to all franchisees, and timely is within 24 hours. And again, I think that's so important.
Great. Yeah. Well, and I think everyone has different expectations for every relationship that they're involved in. So having clear expectations, but then delivering on those expectations or exceeding them is really how you show your value and and increase your credibility. So that's great. I think we're going to throw up a poll question for people that are participating to answer as we go into the next conversation about field reps. How do you tackle that if you don't know where to start? How many franchisees is it realistic for your field person to support? And as people answer this, and then we'll share the results of it, I want to start with you, Doug, and have you share what is the ratio of your field reps to franchisees, and are they divided by, are they in their region that they're supporting? Are they divided by geography, or how do you divvy that up?
Yeah, there's a couple things. First of all, obviously, by geographically is important. I basically have for the 92 restaurants that we have, I have 3 franchise business consultants currently. One takes care of everything of the West because the bulk of our locations are east of the Mississippi. So basically, I have one in the North Michigan down to the Kentucky area, and then the other FBC is in the Southeast. Now, I will tell you that I try, and I think this is important as well, we try and keep those, and even as we build more locations, we're going to try and keep that position at 30 to 35 locations. I was, again, as I said earlier, I was a franchisee in 3 other concepts. One of those particular concepts, I owned 81 locations, and I had one representative that overseen all 81 of those. And even though it was dealing with a single franchisee, that still makes it tough to be able to get out and actually visit the locations on a timely basis to be able to provide accurate feedback. So it's important for us as we move forward. We're going to try and keep it under 40 locations, but where it gets even more important is the amount of franchise groups, because we do have a lot of single unit franchisees in our system. So for them to have 35 locations but be trying to deal with 17 different franchisees, that makes it tough as well. So as we continue to build, I'm trying to keep that ratio that is manageable. So every franchisee and general manager gets the deserved attention from that position.
Perfect. So you're balancing the number of restaurants with the number of franchisees themselves, which is great.
Correct.
Scott, I did not mean to move on. So before you answer the question about your field reps, if you wanted to talk about the relationship or the credibility piece, please feel free to do that and then jump into this answer as well.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Greg made a great point on that credibility piece about the business mind at that number one. It's not surprising to me that was number one on his list with 21% of the folks saying that. Really, to establish credibility, you have to be able to impact the franchisee, what's most important to the franchisee, and frankly, that's the top line and the bottom line. So that goes a long way to establishing credibility. One of the other things that I found was in my career has been important that points to credibility is having courage. One of my old bosses at Domino's used to say, being a field rep is either the hardest job or the easiest job in the company, and it depends on whether you're doing it right. If you're doing it right, it's one of the hardest jobs. If you're doing it wrong, it's one of the easiest jobs. And part of that is courage. You have to act. You have to be able to act according to your principles and the principles of your organization, especially when it's very hard to do that. And believe me, while franchisees may want you to go the short route, you will earn a lot more credibility and respect when you make the right decision, even in the face of hardship. And then lastly, on credibility, don't forget getting to know them a little bit personally. And I'm not talking about being their friend on Facebook so you can see Friday night drinking pictures of each other. Talking about understanding something personal, their kids' names, a birthday, their personal goals, that kind of thing, so that you can connect with them on a human level as well. I think Greg said that a little bit earlier. So back on your the other question about field reps at AFC. Historically, we've been between 25 and 30 units per field rep. I think Doug nailed it perfectly. Don't just think about it in terms of number of units per field rep, but probably even more important is the number of franchisees or franchise group per field rep, because that's really where the bulk of the effort comes in. We're right now at 28 per we call our field reps FBCs. We're higher than I want to be, and I've got approval to hire a fifth one, and we'll get back down and get that lower. One of the important factors is the length of time that a typical field visit takes. In some cases, going back to my experience in the pizza business, a field visit might take 3 hours in a store. With these urgent care clinics, a typical field visit is a day, maybe two, so between 1 and 2 days, and I think that has an impact on the number of units per field rep as well.
Absolutely. There's only a certain amount of hours in the day, so. And so, Greg, I don't know if you have any numbers that you want to share from what you're seeing with the people that you're working with, or what you recommend to people. Is it based on a number of ratio or geography, the size of territory? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think you've got to take into account your budget and your royalty stream as well, depending on the revenues that the franchisees are generating in their business, and therefore your income as a franchisor. You've got to cut your cloth, depending on your budget. So, we recommend around 30 is reasonable. In some groups, it's going to be higher because they just can't afford to put more people on the road. Quality is more important than quantity. I was talking with a client yesterday about this, and they were trying to have someone from the franchisor contacting franchisees weekly, and I just said, that's ridiculous. It's too much. It's fine in the early days, and I'll come back to this a little later, Michelle, when we talk about the stages that franchisees go through. But initially, they're going to want more frequency. But later on, they don't want to see you. They want to see you when they need you, and that might be once a quarter or even as sometimes adequate. So it really depends on the stage the franchisee is at within the system about frequency. But I think those figures that came up in the poll are pretty good.
Good. So I think, Scott, you touched upon the amount of time your visits take, but we have a couple of questions from people asking how often do your field reps do in-person visits? So, and how did you determine that frequency? So, Scott, if you want to start.
Yeah, so our guideline is once a quarter. But Greg just nailed it again. So that frequency is going to kind of depend on where the franchisee is within their franchise life cycle there. When you have a newer franchisee, they need to see your face more often. So in that case, it would be more often than once a quarter. We are geographically dispersed. I didn't mention that. So I have a field rep that's based in Birmingham, Alabama, that's calling on California. So there's some travel time to be considered there. But to your question, the general guidelines once per quarter. I wish I could say I had some magic formula to come up with that, or I read it in Greg's book, or got it from the IFA, or whatever. But it seemed like that was a good fit for our organization and the time it takes to do a field visit.
Perfect. And Doug, how about you? How do you guys? How often are they in the field?
Yeah, and again, there is I think Scott and Greg both said it correctly. I mean, we have to go where we're needed at times. However, what we do is we set and I meet with the team, on a regular basis, and we actually map out our schedules for 4 months at a time. So 3 times a year, we basically set our schedules. Now, those schedules get changed either through new openings or something else that would divert us. But it's not just the FBC out in these locations by themselves, because I hate for them to be out on an island while they're on their own. So I am with them. We have a field marketing team that will go out as well. We have training individuals that will make those trips with us if we have them scheduled correctly. But again, the FBCs have 100% control over their schedule, but I am involved in that scheduling process, because obviously I want to be able to not only be out working with the franchisees so they see that I am there as well, but it is my responsibility to develop the FBCs and some of our field people as well. So it's important that I am that I'm visible and that the franchisees feel comfortable with either calling me directly or when I come into their markets and spend 3 days visiting restaurants, and that they feel comfortable with that as well. But at the end of the day, it's really, if we have down locations, if we have needs in a location, then the FBC will spend more of their time there helping establish a plan of action to be able to get that corrected and get them back in the right direction.
Perfect. So it doesn't sound like you guys have specific field reps that are supporting your new franchisees. It sounds like you both said you're doing it by geography. So do you have startup specialists or resale specialists, specific support for those types of people based on tenure or based on where they're at in their business, or your field rep is just managing that relationship no matter where the franchisee is in that cycle?
It starts and stops with us with the FBC. Now again,
okay.
We have a startup of a brand new location. We have a field team that goes out to be able to help them get open. For example, we have a team that's there 14 straight days and during the prior week and the week that we opened. But the FBC is the direct contact. So everything goes through them as they move forward, either a new franchisee or obviously existing franchisee.
Great. And Scott, you had mentioned that you are really giving a day or two for the length of time that it takes for that field visit. Doug, I don't think that you addressed what does your field visit time length look like?
Yeah, well, and again, it is it depends upon the franchisee. But if we go into a market that has multiple locations, then obviously they will spend multiple days there. There's times where I have FBCs that will fly into a couple different markets during the week. But when we visit the restaurants, we're basically there from usually early in the morning till through dinner. We only require twice a year a full restaurant inspection, although there are other tools that we use while we're inside the location. But if it's a full inspection, that can range anywhere from 6 to 8 straight hours of after it's written and then gone through, and then we obviously help them help them put together a plan of action. So when we're in the markets, we're usually in the restaurants, from both try and get both meal periods in, both lunch and dinner.
Great. So, Greg, I don't know if you have a comment on this, but we had someone ask a question, which I'm going to ask of the panelists, and I'd love your thoughts. But somebody is asking, are franchisors, and I think Mike's going to pull together a poll question so we can get everyone's feedback. Are you using video meeting services to either supplement the field visits or in place of those? I know both of our panelists are doing the in-person, but Greg, do you have any feelings, or are you seeing people effectively using the video meetings?
Yeah. I think this is greatly underutilized. We run a virtual business. This is personally, so all my staff are scattered all over the country. And so we survive and communicate on a daily basis using Skype and GoToMeeting and Zoom and other types of products. I think it's helpful if you're doing a video meeting, that implies visual, that you're looking at each other on a webcam. I think people are often a little lazy with the webcams, but I would encourage you to have a formal time to catch up using a webcam, because when we're talking about communication and demonstrating care and also reading where a franchisee is at in terms of their commitment and so on, there's nothing like being able to read someone's face. And it also produces a higher level of engagement. So I would strongly recommend the use of webcam and video meetings.
That's great. And I think you also can avoid a lot of misinterpretation from tone of voice in a phone call or in a voicemail or in an email. I know that everyone's probably experienced that, where you're like, oh my gosh, is this person meaning to hurt my feelings right now, or am I misreading it? So to that, Scott, are you guys supplementing your field visits, or is any of your staff using video meetings with your franchisees?
We are not doing it officially, Michelle, but I tell you, I am highly interested in this topic for sure. I think there's some applicability. It could be that one or two of my field reps do it, and they do it informally, but we don't have a formal process.
And Doug, how about you guys?
We only use it. I guess this is where the old school, 45 years in the restaurant business comes in, and there's nothing more than a handshake and a face-to-face that you can get so much more done. Although it does tend to be costly at times. We definitely use video conferencing, webinars when it is a system-wide implementation, where we can, if we need to do demonstrations, implementations, we actually do a planning guide webinar for our promotional windows, and those are very effective when it comes to rolling out a new promotion or a new product or something like that. I will even go back a step further. And again, I believe that you mentioned it earlier, Michelle, about the training programs. So, I believe that we've gotten way too automated when it comes to our training, and I think we've seen a deficiency because we see it at the restaurant levels, that we allow the managers to use in-house videos to do the training versus the one-on-one training that should happen on the restaurant or inside the restaurant. So I think there's definitely a need, but I think it has to be appropriately applied. Like I said, I don't think there's anything there's no substitute for for face-to-face and being able to talk about their
right.
franchisee's business.
Right, absolutely. Greg, do you want to speak a little bit more about video?
Yes, if I could. When we get back to what is the purpose of a field consultant or an FPC, and they do, have various roles or functions, and one of those is as a coach, or to improve the performance of the business. So I think the video discussions are highly appropriate when we're having a business discussion. In fact, I've found them to be more useful if you're sharing data and perhaps you're going through a financial statement or some cash flow and so on, that you're both looking at a computer screen together, which is beautiful when you're using some of this technology. You don't have to be physically together. I find it's more efficient to have those discussions on computer using video links and so on than it is face-to-face, where you've got all these distractions. Now, when we're talking about inspecting and maybe doing some training and so on, face-to-face is definitely superior. So it depends on the purpose of the call.
Perfect. Yeah. So we have, we have a couple of questions that are coming in that we will get to. I want to ask very briefly, Scott, I'll start with you. And how do you set expectations with the franchisees regarding what is the role of the field rep? Is that done when they come through the development process? Is it something you're reiterating as you go? How do you make sure that those expectations are aligned?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me and us, it starts at Discovery Day. So I have about an hour per long participation in our Discovery Day. Our development director, Russ Smith, leads the Discovery Day, but I have about an hour part in it, and this is exactly where I cover this. Because it's such a key point about franchising and why somebody chooses to franchise, to buy a franchise in a business instead of doing it on their own, is the support and what they can expect from everybody in the organization. I spend a bunch of time on this. It starts at Discovery Day for us.
Perfect. Doug, how about you guys?
Equally so. I mean, that's the foundation of building that relationship. We talk about expectations of us to the franchisee, and equally we talk about our expectation as them as a franchisee coming into our to our system. But those 2 days or day and a half of Discovery Day is the foundation of getting the expectations set for a new franchisee.
Excellent. Greg, any thoughts for you? You know, is this a written document that outlines this expectation of what the field rep is responsible for, or what's expected of them?
Yeah, I love that question. This is my favorite topic. I would recommend to everybody that there's 2 times to check in with your expectations. Once a year, there should be a formal discussion. It may only go for 5 minutes. It may go for an hour, depending on how complicated the relationship is, where you specifically ask, what are your expectations of me as your support person, field consultant? And you make notes of those, and then you earn the right to then to ask the question and say, well, look, is it okay if I talk about my expectations of you? And you also get clear on that, and I would take notes on those, and you could refer back to those notes if things get a bit sticky or stuck later on in the relationship. The other time to check in is at the end of every visit. And I have something called the magic questions. I'd suggest people write this down because they're very powerful and very helpful. So at the end of every visit, I would recommend that you ask, what was useful, particularly useful about our time together today? And listen very carefully to what the person says. And then you say, and what could I do to make my next visit more useful for you? And again, take some notes. Now, there's a lot of subtle things going on when you have that questioning process. It communicates respect. You're also learning about how to improve your effectiveness, which is our theme today, and you're also aligning expectations.
Perfect. I love it. So someone had chatted in, and I think it's interesting that they use the video conferencing and calls for new franchisees to help establish that trust and that relationship until they get to them in person at first, which I think is a really great piece. And I think that also helps for the smaller systems or the people that are limited by budget or resources of people, as Greg mentioned, and to use that as a way to help build that personal connection before you can get there. So that's really good. And they said that they're using Ring Central is who they're using to do all that through. So I thought I'd throw that out there. So I want to move on to making the most of an in-person visit. And as we do that, and I think that you guys can roll these questions that have come in from people into this conversation, but people are very curious as far as how are you documenting these field visits? And I don't know if they mean that on a technology side or how is that information from the field rep translated to corporate, or where is that being held? So the question was, how are you documenting internally those field visits, and how are you holding the field staff accountable for where they're supposed to be with those visits? So that's kind of a combination of another question that was more of what programs are you using for inspections. So I think one is more of that structure piece, and the other is maybe capturing the essence of the meeting and the conversation that's being had. So let's tackle that before we go into the making the most of each visit that you have. Doug, if you'd like to start with this one.
Sure. I think there's two major pieces that we use, and we'll talk quickly about the inspection that I mentioned earlier. We actually use Zenput as a source to be able to document our our restaurant evaluations. Now, the great thing about that is it's, we're able to embed pictures of things that we see along with comments, and obviously there's a scoring system. As soon as the FBC is finished with the inspection and completes it, it's automatically a copy of it goes straight to the restaurant, goes straight to the franchisee. I get a copy of every one of those. And so that's the one that we do twice a year. On the opposite ends of those visits, we do another piece. It's almost I think it's 8 pages long, but it's a business review, and we actually set and do a deep dive into the business twice a year. With the franchisee, and this touches everything. We view our business in 3 different pieces. It's people, sales, and profits, in that order. So the business review is dissected into those three pieces. So we talk a lot about the people, training, staffing, and so on. A lot about sales, which is operations, scheduling, and a lot of detail, and then obviously the profitability of the location. Those 2 disciplines we do not veer from. The franchisees want that. It's been very valuable. They utilize that feedback. And it's so we do not veer. We have a number of other little tools that we use, maybe for shorter visits, but those are the 2 major visits or 2 major pieces, 4 visits a year that we have a lot of structure to.
Perfect. So you're not taking any kind of notes about the relationship part, or your franchise field rep is not sharing that back with corporate?
Yes, it all gets, I guess I am corporate, I guess is my,
okay.
Yeah, it all comes back, everything comes back to me and is all documented and then housed at our office. So yes, absolutely, all that comes back, every piece of that comes back directly to me.
Okay. And Scott, how about you guys? How are you tracking all of that data?
So I'm a firm believer in having a set routine, a set cadence and routine for your field visits. I think that includes some type of field visit report form. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that we have not yet developed at AFC. The team of FBCs has been working on that project for quite some time, and we haven't fully implemented it. But if I go back to using my other experience, having some type of visit documentation where you have you know what your key KPIs are for the business, you know what is important and helps drive top line and bottom line revenue, and those are the things that you should be paying attention to on the visit, and your visit form should be outlined around that. So having some type of documentation. I'm really intrigued by Fran Connect's field visit program, and we've explored that a couple of times and may explore that again in the not so distant future as well. The one thing that is critical, though, is whatever occurs during a field visit gets documented back to the franchisee in the form of a letter recapping the visit, what was discussed, any areas of compliance or non-compliance rather. But you have to be careful to make sure that you put positive points about the visit as well as any compliance issues or points of improvement. I know you're going to get to underperforming in a couple of other slides, but it's important to document that stuff back after the visit's completed.
Perfect. So I'm gonna, Greg, I want to stop with you, and I'm going to have you go into your slides, your next slide. So we've talked about that how you support each franchisee is not the same. So how can field consultants adjust their approach when dealing with different types of franchisees? And I think you're starting with based on where they are in their business on your next slide here.
Yeah. Could I just ask, before we go on to that, could you just flick back to the previous slide, because I've got a comment on that. I didn't want people to get distracted. Thank you. The issue of technology and documentation and systems, I think is obviously important, and it's evolving. but we need to be careful we don't delude ourselves that having an online system or a check is going to somehow improve effectiveness. We need to, the title of this session is Improving Effectiveness, not Improving Efficiency. And as we all know, sometimes we get preoccupied with efficiency and doing the wrong things more efficiently. And just coming back to our opening comment around credibility, you build credibility by being effective, not by being efficient. My mother had a fall on Friday and had to go into hospital for 4 days. She cracked some ribs. And I was observing very acutely what was going on in that hospital and how the nurses were going about their business. And there's a lot of really good analogies, I think, in terms of healing and being effective if you're a nurse. And what I noticed was the nurses that had low credibility with the patients were very efficient. They would come in with their checklists and their monitors, and they'd take the blood pressure, and they were almost a bit agitated about getting the job done and ticking off their tasks. The nurses that were effective in terms of settling the patient down and reassuring the patients and so on were showing that level of care, that genuine connection. And what I noticed, they listened with their eyes as well as their ears, and they really engaged with the patient. So I think there's a lesson here. If we want to be effective, we've got to connect and engage with the franchisees in the discussions. And efficiency, yes, it's important and it's good to have systems and processes, but let's not get too hung up on that. Sorry, that was just a comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's the bedside manner. It's important to have it, and I think everyone's experienced doctors and nurse and hospital staff that have it, and those that don't, and it makes a difference.
Oh, I just laugh sometimes. You see these field consultants, and they think that their credibility somehow comes from the power they have in having this checklist, or they walk in with some sort of form, and they're going through with the franchise. They're going through doing these inspections. Yeah, they're important and standards are important, but that's only a small part of the role. Now, in terms of support and relevant support, if we could move to the next slide, and that's the stages in the business evolutional journey of the franchisee. And you can see there's 6 stages there, starting with investigation, and that's before the franchisee has joined you. We were talking earlier, Doug and Scott were talking about expectations. And the expectations are largely formed, and I think Doug mentioned this in terms of Discovery Day, during that investigation stage. The franchisee hasn't signed the franchise agreement yet, but their expectations of you and are being formed. They're taking very careful notes mentally and probably also maybe on an iPad or on a pad, a pen and paper, about the things that the franchise sales manager is saying to them. We'll be in touch with you every week. We'll help you with your labour and your staffing and so on. So we need to be very careful what we're saying up front around in setting those expectations. The green box there, initiation, is when the franchisee is going through their formal training, and obviously there's specific types of support and education going on there. I think we need to remember that the technical sides of the business are going to largely be forgotten during that training because they get overloaded, but they will remember issues about culture and about your values. So I would focus more on, during that training, how do we want to engage with you and communicate with each other. And I was talking with a client recently. They had a franchisee who they said was driving them nuts, and I'm sure we've all got. Our statistics show around 20% of your franchisees at any stage are going to be driving you nuts for different reasons. And a lot of that was to do with, misaligned expectations around how they engage in a professional way. They felt she was being very unprofessional in her comments and her attitudes towards the field consultant. So that initiation stage, I think, again, setting up how we're going to work together is important. The perspiration stage, franchisees are going to need more intensive support. I would suggest weekly contact would be essential, a lot of hand-holding, and that may go on for, between 3 to 12 months until they break even and start making money. They're going to be sweating it out in that stage. When they hit consolidation, everything comes together, and so I've deliberately called it consolidation. They're into a rhythm. They've got usually a base of clients that are returning, and they've got a stable team with them. That's the time when you start to get into those business conversations and start to move from working in the business with an operational focus to working on the business with them. And at the consolidation and the next stage, the maturation stage, I think they're all over their operations. They don't need a lot of help with that. They need more help on profitability issues and efficiency issues and productivity issues. And in the maturation stage, and I've been sharing some data with Eric, Michelle, your boss, around what are the tenure figures with regard to franchisees. And we're both finding in America and in Australia that the tenure of franchisees on average 6 years or more is about 53%. So the bulk of franchisees are in that maturation stage. They can start to get a bit complacent. They can get distracted. They can start to rust out a little bit, rather than they'll burn out in the perspiration stage, but they rust out to get bored in that maturation stage. And that's where we need to reset their goals with them and set new challenges, and maybe it's time, they should be thinking of exiting the system, or maybe it's time they should be falling back in love with their business by expanding and opening new units. So the type of support they need in maturation is normally conversations with more senior people in the organisation around their strategy going forward. And that final stage, reformation, is where they reinvest back in their business. And we might be talking about, $500,000 if they're opening up new units. So they also need intensive support again during reformation, because if they make a bad decision, investment decision to take on some extra units and they're not ready, that can send them broke. And then I would suggest they move through the cycle again.
Perfect. So we're still focusing on how to make the most of the in-person visit, and I want to start with Doug, because I have a question on what was the name of the company that you use for tracking the information for your field visits that you mentioned?
It's Zimput. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, could you spell it maybe?
I think it's Zenput, I think, and actually Scott had mentioned we're still talking with FranConnect. It's a very similar process that FranConnect offers as well. This Zimput is a smaller company, and we like working with smaller companies, and they've been very adaptable for us.
Good, good. So I'm going to have you talk about making the most of an in-person visit, but Greg, I've had the opportunity to attend some of the operation stuff that you've done in person, and you didn't bring this up, so I'm going to bring it up because I think it's so great that you recommend this, is when you talk about it's important to have the agenda set before the field rep person walks in. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, just kind of making sure that those expectations are aligned of what that visit's going to be about before people come to it.
Yeah, sure. So we talk about having a joint agenda, and I'm not talking about sucking on marijuana here, but the joint agenda is around, that was a really corny dad joke, by the way.
I was going to say, that's after the field visit.
Yeah. the franchisee,
only in Colorado.
Right, only in Colorado, right. They need to feel like they're a partner in this process rather than the visits being done to them. And I think a good way to do that is to allow them to have some input in what's going to be talked about and what's important to them. And that can be done, obviously sending an email and saying, hey, I'm going to be, coming out next week, want to check in, what's going to make this a great visit for you. You may do it over the phone with a 5-minute call saying, I want you to think for a moment about the challenges that you're facing in your business and what you're trying to achieve. Now, given that, what's going to make our time together really useful next week? And that you may even use one of the online systems that we've been talking about to set that. And I find that makes a huge difference to the franchisee being prepared for your visit mentally and also physically, because sometimes you just rock up, they're not there or they're forgotten, so they're not physically engaged as well as mentally engaged. So that would be my comment there. Obviously, in some of the food franchises, you have unannounced visits, which are more about quality control, and that's fine. But I think that should be a minority of the visits, in my view.
Perfect. Scott, do you have anything else that you would like to add about making the most of the in-person visit with your field rep?
Yeah, I was going to say something about announced versus unannounced visits as well, and Greg talked about that. I think that has a place in just about any franchise system, even ours, which the operations may be a bit complex. Even unannounced visits do have a place, but I'm with Greg in the sense that shouldn't be all of them. That sets a tone, a problematic tone with the franchisee. But mixing in some unannounced visits gives you a sense for the actual performance of the franchise business on a daily basis versus the performance that they want you to see when you're there.
Mm-hmm. So how much, we did get a question, how much notice are for the announced visits, how much notice are you giving before that visit?
In our case, it could be as much as 30 days because we're having to make airline reservations and whatnot, and you want to make sure that you can have the franchisee's attention. It's not like you can just say on June the 2nd, hey, I'm going to visit your market next week, and I expect you to be there. There's a bit of coordination that takes place there. Now, if you're field consultants, if you're an organization that has the size where they live in their territory and it's a drive everywhere, then you can shorten up that lead time to a week or maybe two to coordinate schedules.
Awesome. Doug, how about you?
Again, I agree completely. I want to talk quickly about the unannounced visits. There is a need for those at times, but those are not what we're all about, because it does send, and Greg mentioned it, it does send a negative tone. There is, again, if it's appropriate, then obviously we will build those into our routine. In terms of the timing, Scott said it perfectly. I mean, from a 14 to 28 days out, again, we as I said earlier, we try and map out our schedules, 4 months at a time. So, we have enough lead time to be able to tell the franchisees when we're going to be there, so we can accomplish what we want to get done with the franchisee being able to be in attendance.
Perfect. So we are coming up on our time that we're supposed to go to Q&A, and we have a lot more topics to cover, and I don't want to skip them, so I'm going to move a little quickly through the next couple slides. The first, I think that you guys have addressed it well, the panelists, and we're going to throw up a poll question to see you in the audience. But we want to understand, are your field reps responsible for compliance checks, and is their role really more of a cop, or is it more of a coach approach? So we'll get that from the audience as we talk about. I think you guys have done a good job articulating that there's both, that they both need to be done, and it sounds like you all have your field reps being responsible for the compliance. If I'm not correct, please let me know. There was a question about if you use third-party vendors at all to measure the compliance piece of it. Do either of you do that?
We do not. It's
okay.
Just not, again, it's just not something that I would choose to do at this point.
And Scott, how about you?
We don't either, Michelle.
Okay.
Now this whole compliance versus the cop versus coach thing is so critically important in the field rep's role. And historically, my feeling has always been that as much as possible, the field rep should separate from the compliance or the cop role, and there should be another entity if you can, but that's just going to depend on the size of the system. If you're an emerging system with 30 units, it's really hard for you to do that. If you're a 1,500 unit franchise, you might have the ability to segregate those functions. But having said all of that, it's really important that the field rep never extract themselves from the role of compliance officer, because whether it's their key role or not, it's still one of their roles that they wear with their franchisee.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and if I could just.
Yeah, absolutely, Doug. Go ahead.
No, I just want to chime in real fast because it is very important, because we do not want, we refer to it inside our organization as we do not ever want to be the pasta police, because whenever we do an evaluation or anything like that, it needs to be a teachable moment. I wish we never even scored our evaluations, but we do just to measure it. But every time, that's the only reason why we're in there. Doing those duties is to make sure that we are teaching the franchisee or the general manager how to move their business forward. So I don't ever want us to be a cop. I always want us to be a coach.
So you're using the compliance as a training opportunity to just make sure you're protecting the brand. Okay, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and again, it serves both functions that way. But I want it to be a learning moment, not just holding them accountable to times and temperatures.
Right. Good. So you're measuring it so that you can move it if it needs to be improved. So Greg, I want to ask you a question. How can field reps, when they're trying to balance this piece, how can field reps make sure that the visit ends on a positive note, and what do you recommend they do if it doesn't end on a positive note?
If I can just say a few things in defense of cops.
Go for it.
Some of you may have read an article that I gave you, Michelle, which I think was posted on your website in preparation for this session. But I think the cop role is really important. But I loved Doug's comment about teachable moments, and the story I was relating in that article was I was pulled over for speeding as a young guy, and the cop made that a teachable moment for me, and it still stays with me to that day about why it's not a good idea to speed. So rather than just punish me by giving me a ticket for $90, he educated me. And I think this links back to your question, Michelle, about finishing on a positive note and so on. Sometimes we need to have conversations that are not pleasant. And early on, Scott was saying, either this job is the hardest job or the easiest job. And if it's the hardest job, you're doing your job right. And I would agree with that it's difficult sometimes to give feedback if something's not right. But if you set it up in a framework and say, hey, I want to talk with you about something, and it's important because I care about your profitability and I care about the success of your business. This is my job. And there's something I want to talk with you about that I think is potentially going to undermine that. Can we have a discussion about that? So you're setting up the conversation in a constructive way. It's got a meaning or a purpose. And then you give your feedback, and you're very direct and to the point with it. And I think that's how you keep conversations positive. And even if the discussion's got a bit testy and at the end you're leaving, I think you can thank the franchisee for their engagement with you, for working with you, and review what's happened over the last, whether it's an hour or 3 hours, that you think it has been useful in terms of improving their profitability. And I think ending on that note of just reminding them that you do care, I think is probably the most powerful way. And it also comes back to the issue of your credibility as well. We said that credible consultants and coaches demonstrate their care. So that would be my comment on that.
So Doug and Scott, I want to go to you guys. Scott, I'll start with you. So let's say it ends on a bad note. How do you guys handle field reps whose franchisees are underperforming, or if there's a disagreement or a butting of heads between the two?
Just fire them all.
I think that's a good way to go.
Yeah, just good. You know, it again, it's so situational because how you deal that question goes to, well, how do you deal with a franchisee? Period. You know, and every franchisee is a bit different. Yeah, so I don't want to appear like I'm running from that question, but I will say that communication has got, so rather than run from the communication, you have to attack the communication head on. I think Greg said that just a couple of minutes ago. I have found that when you have a situation where they're butting heads and there's a disagreement there, that more communication is going to draw that out and resolve that problem than less communication. And boy, that communication better be over the telephone, or it better be in person as opposed to emails, because an email string can take that headbutting and it can turn it into a nuclear war. So effective communication, I think, is the key to resolving that kind of problem.
And so you're talking about the conflict between a franchisee and a field rep, and are you also saying that that's the best way to address when a field rep has underperforming franchisees?
No, I was really talking about the conflict between the field rep and the franchisee with
Perfect.
That.
Okay, so let's pause on that one then. So Doug, how about you? How do you guys help settle things down, or do you get involved when franchisees and field reps don't see eye to eye on something, or there's some kind of conflict?
I think that if we've, in almost the majority of our cases, if we've done our job at the very beginning in terms of establishing a relationship, you know, because we have these, there's probably one of these kinds of discussions going on out in the restaurant right now with one of our field reps. They happen all the time. But if we've done our job establishing the relationship and have that credibility in us coming in and being able to give the right feedback that is and for all the right reasons, these discussions tend in our case, and in majority cases, don't elevate to the level that I have to get involved. Have I had to get involved? Absolutely. And when three of us talk, we usually can all agree and move it back in the direction it needs to go. But you know, it all comes back to that foundation, and so when we do have these tough conversations, that we don't have to have a lot of wasted energy to try and get to where we need to be able to help the individual and help the business move forward.
Perfect. So then, Scott, the second part of it is how do you handle field reps who have franchisees that are underperforming? How do you address that?
So you separate that because there's a difference between effort and execution here. And again, you know, I keep going back to the difference in the franchisees. If you know that the underperformance in that area is related to the efforts and the relations of the field rep to the franchisee. In other words, the field rep isn't being effective, then you need to, the leader needs to jump in there and redirect and retrain that field rep. If it's back on the franchisee, which it is in a lot of cases, then you've got to apply whatever other resources you can to help that franchisee. Ultimately, if there's a continued track record of failure to perform, then you're going to have to take an additional step, which may be coaching that franchisee to choosing his or her next career.
Great. So I'm going to go, we have to skip a couple things. I'm going to just end up with this measuring effectiveness of field reps. How do you guys measure effectiveness of your field reps? Are you getting feedback from your franchisees after visits? Are you tying their performance to any bonus or salary or any kind of metrics that you're holding them to? And then Greg, I'm going to wrap with you and have you talk about ways that you see people doing that as well. But Doug, if you want to start in how you're measuring the effectiveness of your field reps, that would be great.
Yeah, well, and again, in our case, I will tell you, there's one measure, and there's one measure, or two measures, I guess, that we really look hard at. One is one that we see all the time, and that comes down to the sales performance at the location. Obviously, the profitability is the franchisee's side of the business, and we'll help that along. But it really comes down to, are we seeing increase in sales? Are we seeing increase in guest counts? So, and if that's the case, that's the ultimate measurement for a franchisor looking into the franchisee's business. It is, our job is to protect the brand, help them increase their sales, and help them increase their profits. Just that simple. There's not a franchisee that gets into the business that's not in here to make money. So that's one of the pieces. I have a lot of soft skills and so on that I measure the franchise or the FBC on as well. But and I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
The second was, do you ask your franchisees for feedback on their perception of the effectiveness of the field rep?
Right, and we do. We have an internal feedback session that we get, and then obviously we use the franchise business review survey that we're currently doing as well. You did mention about their bonus. I have a small portion of their bonus that is because our bonus structure is a little bit different for everybody that's outside the restaurant level, but I do have a small portion of their bonus that's tied to sales performance, guest counts, and then we also have some guest recovery measurements and so on that their bonus is tied to.
Perfect. Scott, to you.
Yeah, I echo Doug on the fact that the effectiveness of a field rep can be measured by the results that come out of the franchise. One of my old bosses used to say, what gets measured gets done. So if it's an important KPI for your system, you ought to benchmark your FBC areas or your field rep areas against those benchmarks as well. I'll put the plug in for you guys, Michelle. We do use franchise business review. We've done an annual survey ever since I came on board. One of the questions allows us to get feedback directly from the franchisees about their franchise business consultant, and we do this for every position that touches franchisees in our organization, and we measure the improvement in that year over year, and that's part of the field rep feedback system is how well they do in their franchisees' eyes with respect to their support.
Perfect. And then Greg, how about you as far as any tips you have on effective ways to measure that effectiveness or that relationship that the franchisee and franchise field rep are having?
Sure. Look, if we're talking about the effectiveness of the person in their role, I was mentioning earlier that it's quite a general role. It's like a general practitioner. You've got to be good at a whole lot of stuff. I think it's good to be very specific in asking for feedback, and I would suggest asking franchisees for feedback around the reliability. For instance, does your field consultant turn up on time? Do they have do an agenda with you and so on? I would be asking some questions about how effective they are in analysing your metrics with you. I'd ask some questions about how effective they are at developing, skills and competencies of yourself and your staff, and so on. So looking at the job description and coming up with some behavioural descriptions of effectiveness, I think is good. That's only one angle, of course. That's the franchisee's opinion. I think at the end of the day, there's three things that matter always in every conversation between a field consultant and the franchisee needs to be touching on one or more of these. The first one is around profitability, unit level profitability. And I think one measure of the field consultant's effectiveness is, are the franchisees in their territory profitable? And if they're not, really getting down to what can be done to improve the profitability. So that would be one area. The second area is around, I call it brand alignment. Are the units, the standards up to scratch? And there's various ways, obviously, to measure that. So that would be also a measure of effectiveness. You know, you could call it compliance if you like. And the third measure is around constructive participation. So is the franchisee a constructive, positive citizen in the franchise network? And are any problem behaviours being addressed and discussed? So, for instance, is the franchisee an advocate for the business? Are they turning up to meetings and conferences and so on? I would put that largely back to the field consultant to have those conversations and educate the franchisee about what is appropriate behaviour and constructive behaviour. So that would be my comments on that.
I think that's perfect. I'm going to turn it right over to Mike to start banging through some questions before we have to wrap up from the audience.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, excellent.
All right, sorry about that. We just had some weird phone issue going on here. Apologies for that. I'm going to jump right into these questions. Thank you for keeping the audience entertained for a couple minutes there. So one of the great questions that came in, and this has kind of been covered in pieces along the way, is other than the actual visits itself, what else is in the field rep's job description? So what are the other responsibilities that they have outside of the visits? So Scott, let me start with you for that.
That's a great question. I doing some quick thinking here. Recognition is one of those things. So, you know, we've been talking about visits, but you know, oftentimes you see great performance out in the franchisee land, and it's important for the field rep to see that and be able to provide recognition to that franchisee, preferably amongst their peers. Best practice sharing, and of course, you know, that relates to the visits as well. But field reps should be gleaning best practices. If you know franchisee A is having an issue with you know, whatever it is, people management, then you're looking in your area, determining who is great at people management and being able to share some best practices with them. So there's a couple of things I'd throw out and open it up to the other folks.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
No, I will tell you that our team, I mean, they're involved in all the strategic thinking, all the planning. So it's not just the the field visits. They're involved. I mean, so many different processes to be able to get to, for as we roll out pieces. I also have them individually dissected into, as I mentioned earlier, the people, sales, and profits. Each one of those, the field reps carry those and work with those specific departments at our support office in Lexington, Kentucky, and then bring that information back out. Scott, you just mentioned a perfect example of best practice sharing. We put on an annual meeting. We just had it in Atlanta last week, as a matter of fact, that they put on that meeting. This is our 6th annual meeting. It's been themed as franchisees helping franchisees, and it's basically 2 days of best practice sharing. So yeah, I mean, it is so much more than just the field visits. They truly make up the operations side of of our franchise department, and work with other pieces of our company. So yeah, they wear quite a few different hats throughout the year.
That's great. Thank you, Doug. Greg, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think it was touched on. There's a word called facilitation that has a very specific meaning, and it means that the field consultant, if they're playing that role of a facilitator, is working with a group of people to help those people have meaningful, useful conversations. And Michelle's been doing an excellent job, you know, in this webinar today in facilitating the conversation, and you are now, Mike. So I think it comes back to the field consultant, when they get a group of franchisees together, this idea of best practice sharing, it can actually be done very effectively or very ineffectively. So part of their role is to understand there are skills and techniques, and there's a whole science around how to be a good facilitator. And even the way you set up a room can make a huge difference. I think that's an important part of their role. Some of our clients, the field consultants, are facilitators for the performance groups that they're running, and that's quite a high level you know, abilities you need to be a good performance group facilitator, but that would be another role.
Thank you. That was a great answer from all three of you to that question. So there's lots of different pieces we can add to that job description in different systems. I'm going to switch gears to a more logistical question, and I'm going to combine a couple here. Separate questions that came in. How long is the standard visit with a field rep? And are there a specific number of days per month that field rep travel, and is there a consistent travel schedule, like on a weekly basis, certain days of the week? I'm just going to combine all of them. Any thoughts that you have on just those logistics of the visits and the schedule? Greg, I'll start back with you.
I don't really have any comments there. I think the other guys would have something more useful.
Sure. Doug, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we travel usually 5 days a week. It does include some weekends, because obviously we're selling pasta on the weekends as well. But yeah, most of them and myself are usually take out on a Monday and may not get home till Friday or Saturday. Not every week is like that, but yeah, it does require travel in our case.
Great. And Scott?
Yeah, you know, we're probably not quite as regimented as a lot of systems are. I remember the days of being on the road, and as Doug said, being on the road 4 or 5 days a week. We're a little less regimented than that. My field reps wind up spending more time, a little bit more time in the office, because they truly do, and I failed to mention this on the earlier question, they truly do act like an executive team of AFC, the 4 field reps that I have. There is a lot of travel. I don't have a set number of days per month they're traveling. They set that schedule according to the needs of the franchisees, and in an effort to try to hit that general guideline of 1 visit per month.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to squeeze one more question in here before I let everyone go. I did chat out a link earlier for the feedback survey for this webinar, so I'd love if everybody could just take 30, 60 seconds and let us know how we did, aside from that weird phone incident a few moments ago. So please send us your feedback that way. And I'm going to end just on a general question about technology and software. I know we've covered this a little bit already. Somebody asked about software that you would use for expense reporting. So if you have any recommendations on that as it pertains to field reps and compliance, any other softwares that you'd like to mention, and generally any other resources, suppliers or anything like that that we haven't already mentioned that you'd like to shout out, please do so. So Scott, let me start with you.
Can't really think of anything. We do manual expense reporting via Excel spreadsheets. So whoopee, everybody does that. We do, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of air travel just because of the way the regions are set up now. We use Concur to manage the air travel. There's an expense involved with that. They they bang you out $10 a trip. I suspect that over the long term, I probably save, even though I'm paying $10 a trip, because we can be more efficient in managing the type of tickets that are purchased. But that's the only one that comes to mind.
Oh, that's great, thank you. And Doug, are there any others that you'd like to mention?
Nothing that I can think of. I mean, again, as Scott said, I mean, most of the easier things we do, we use Excel spreadsheets and so on. I will mention that our back of the house system is crunch time. I know there was a number of or the majority of our participants were from the food segment, so we use crunch time as our back of the house management system, which manages all our receivables, our payroll, food costs, labor costs, and so on. But that'd truly be the only one that I'd probably have out there. So.
Great, thank you, Doug. And Greg, finally, anything that you'd like to add?
No, not on expense systems.
All right.
Did we lose Michelle again?
Hey, there's my dog.
One way to do a grand finale.
Sorry, guys, I was then now having headset issues, but just want to thank everybody for your time joining us today, and also to just mention that Greg will be in the States in July and is available to help and come into your franchise systems to help with more specific issues that you're having. And I have information up here. Katrina Mitchell with Speak actually handles booking Greg's time while he's here. And you've heard, I don't know if Doug mentioned it on this call, he was talking about it before we joined with everybody, but both Doug and Scott have sung the praises of Greg's books. They are really very tactical, and I can't stress enough how helpful they are. Easy to read, easy to implement, and you can get the books through Katrina as well. And we have up, it looks like Leo's got a book that's specifically recommended for everyone.
Yeah, very sophisticated taste. Yeah.
I love it. I also would like to say I know a lot of people are joining us that are getting their CFEs, which means that you're members of the IFA, and the Franchise Relations Committee. The event that you guys put on the day before, which Greg, you've done the last couple years, is so fantastic. And I know that when the conference wraps, you are so nice to share all the great tips that come out. And that's available through the Fran Social Network and through your blog post there. So I would encourage everyone to grab that because you will at least find one little nugget in that as well. So that's going to wrap for today. Our next session is coming up on Thursday. We were doing our call today at 4 o'clock to accommodate Greg joining us from 12 hours ahead in the future. And I appreciate your time doing that. And we look forward to our next session. And thank you guys all for your time and your expertise today.
Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Excellent facilitation.